Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss Faith and Reason, subtitle, Philosophers Explain Their Turn to Catholicism. And last week we discussed the chapter by J. Budziszewski, and now we'll discuss an author that I can pronounce, Brian Cutter. But I noticed, I guess we've all noticed this, that there's a lot of similarities in these accounts of conversion. At the same time, each one is unique. One of the similarities is, to me, is that because they're scholars or intellectuals or thinkers or professional academicians, they are interested in books. And so I've been kind of keeping a running track of which books they mention. And so far in my list, it's Lewis, Chesterton, and Tolkien are the three authors that seem to come up pretty frequently. But let's move into the next chapter, chapter 3, down the labyrinth. Go ahead, Joseph.
Well, just to say, you were talking about writers being mentioned, and I was just very pleased with the beginning. This one he begins with about 15 lines from one of my favorite poems, The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson. Thompson, of course, famous Catholic poet of the end of the 19th, early 20th century, very influential on others, greatly admired by Chesterton. So I was just pleased that, as you say, the literary aspect of this is a pleasant surprise to me, as they're philosophers and not literature people per se.
And in almost every case we've had so far, there's a kind of a two-pronged effect we're seeing. One is their reading and their study. The other is their friends, wives, people they've met, and so on. The two really seem to come together. So let's go down the labyrinthine ways. On page 80, the second page, he says, my first real exposure to serious Christian thought came through reading C.S. Lewis in high school. So there you have it, you know.
Yeah,
and then at the bottom of the page, studying church history, visiting Western Europe, and reading a lot of G.K. Chesterton. It's very dangerous, isn't it, Joseph?
It's very dangerous, exactly. As Chesterton said, as Lewis said of Chesterton, first reading Chesterton, a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading.
Right. And what another common feature these men share, in addition to which goes hand in hand with why they're drawn to writers like Lewis and Chesterton, is because when it comes to matters of faith or religion, this is something they want to think about. It's not something they just want to accept as this is the way I was raised, or not raised, as the case may be, or even this is the prevailing atmosphere at my school of philosophy where I'm getting my PhD. These are people who like to ask questions and probe matters that are important. And it's because of having those kinds of minds that these men go on the journeys they do.
And why Chesterton and Lewis are so often quoted, because that's the apologetics of reason, of course. And these people are philosophers, but they write so well, Lewis and Chesterton. So, clearly people are drawn to the beauty of the way that reason is being done, if you like, in people such as Lewis and Chesterton. And
I think, Vivian, an important point, which is an extension of what you just said, yes, philosophers, professional philosophers, there are people who generally like to ask the question, why? But as Aristotle says, all men desire to know. They want to know why. It's just that these people are, as it were, almost grasped by it, almost, obsessed with it. But it's something that we all do, or at least we should do. And anytime someone is able to extract himself or herself, or to distance himself from the noise around, or this continual buzz around us of the media and our activities, which are ephemeral, as they say in Greek, ephemera means upon the day, then those questions come up. So I think it's an important lesson from this book is that people should be encouraged to ask questions.
Yes. And ask questions of, even the prevailing atmosphere in the academy, because these men are all schooled now in materialism of thought, of mind, of reality, and they're beginning to realize that this just doesn't make sense if my mind is just moving molecules caused by other moving molecules. So what is thought? What is mind? The fact that they ask these questions, in spite of the fact that there is a dogmatism in the academy that they've already received, and the fact that they aren't content with that and say, this doesn't make sense, there must be more to it, and keep...
And Brian Cutter is like the archetypical case of what you just said. On page 81, he discusses those very things. He talks about at the top the core philosophical commitments, which he began with in graduate school, specifically metaphysical naturalism, and then the physicalist view of the mind, which is a subset of naturalism. If nature is all there is all material, then of course the mind must be material too. But then, at the bottom of that page, he says that he was persuaded that the only rational approach there could be to philosophical questions was the Morean or conservative approach. Well, what is that? He goes on. You start with what you initially find plausible. This is the very bottom of the page. That is, you accept as a starting point where you are with the academy and with this naturalism, materialism that kind of surrounds us. But then we should only abandon these convictions if they can be shown to conflict with claims that are even more plausible. So that's where the questioning comes in. You accept the fact we all begin with presuppositions, or with what we've been imbibed from our mother's milk, so to speak. But then the question is, well, is that the most plausible explanation of experience, or is there something that has the claim to be more plausible? So this is kind of an anatomy, if you will, of that very thought process, Vivian, you're talking about.
On page 84, he seems to see the tension from trying to live without any sort of transcendental or metaphysical reality. So after that lift quote there, after that indented passage, I also recall being haunted during this time by the thought that by renouncing religion, I had made myself into a truncated and stunted human being. I came to feel that a life without worship was a half-human life. Against the backdrop of this nagging thought, I came to see the intellectual posture I had affected toward religion as bordering on moral perversity. I have in mind specifically the habit I had developed of systematically discounting my own, not uncommon, religious experiences. I do not mean strange visions or booming voices or anything like that. I mean experiences like the feeling of being in touch with things transcendent. So so you see there basically that he's aware of transcendence as an experience, and yet has to explain it away because it doesn't fit into the round hole that he's made because of his materialistic philosophy.
Yes, he says in that quote, he has this fear or sense that he may have made himself into a truncated human being. Lewis, in his book Miracles, speaks of what he calls truncated thought. Now, of course, To truncate something is to cut it off. Like a pyramid, you cut off the top and it's truncated. And Lewis's point was that, after, especially in the 17th, 18th centuries, with the rise of modern science and the great discoveries and the tremendous progress that was made, there was a tendency to consider knowledge as that which you could achieve by this method, the scientific method, which is a subset of total knowledge, and definitely not including wisdom. And so that what Lewis was saying is that once we have this truncated form of knowledge, we're become blind to or insensitive to the fact that that's not everything. There's something more. And so what he's experiencing here is that he kind of felt this diminishment that, well, there's, what about the transcendent? I get these ideas, these thoughts, and I can't just suppress them all my life,
I'm also thinking of C.S. Lewis's image in The Abolition of Man, men without chests. So the truncation here is you've got a head and you've got legs, and it's what's the in between that's been excised. And it's precisely along the lines of the so-called feelings, because Lewis introduces this idea with the example of the men in front of the waterfall.
Yes.
Right? And one man says it's sublime, and the other man says, no, you're having sublime feelings. Right? And so this whole reduction of any sense of awe, or like he describes, he had religious experiences. He had some sense of the transcendent of something. But if you're trained to discount those things, ignore those things, that's just your subjective emotional life that has no pertinence here, then you do become a man without a chest. You do become a dehumanized human.
And I like as well, you have Lewis's Men Without Chest from The Abolition of Man, but I also love T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men, which is basically saying the same thing, that the modern man has no substance, he's hollow. And that was taken up by Evelyn Waugh in Brides Heavily Visited, with various characters such as Hooper and Rex Mottram, who were described as not being fully real, right, as being hollow. So I think this understanding of what he did, to refuse to embrace anything except materialism, we are becoming truncated, stunted, we're without chests, and we're hollow. And this is exactly what he's saying there. He's not fully human. If he's going to insist there's nothing but matter, he ceases to be fully human.
And there's a place for recreation and play and sport and entertainment. But because I believe it's, man is not satisfied, unless he finds the transcendent, that if you spend your life with that void, but filling it with things which are little value in themselves, mere ephemera and mere entertainment, then of course you never ask the question. But what this whole book is showing us that these are people. Why did they become Christians and then Catholics? Because they pulled back, at least periodically, from the surrounding fluff in order to ask those questions.
Mm-hmm. And similarly to the argument that Lewis builds in Abolition of Man, showing you really the horror that moral relativism leads to. On the bottom of page 86, this author is coming to the conclusion that moral relativism can't be true. Why? Because it would mean that it would deny claims such as the following: torturing infants for fun is wrong. So sometimes, you do have to take the logic out to see where it goes. If nothing is wrong, then I suppose torturing infants for fun isn't wrong either. And once you see this, then you start recoiling in horror, really, as to where moral relativism leads.
That's right. And that was one area where he began to see if I'm going to say that some things are wrong, I can't be a moral relativist and I can't be materialist. And then on page 87, new paragraph, a second epistemic capacity of knowledge of humans that seem to me to tell against natural is our capacity to do science. And this is something that Ratzinger Benedict mentioned many times, that isn't this kind of strange that our minds seek the intelligible and the universe is intelligible? Why is that,
Well, who was it said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is intelligible? Who said that? Something
Einstein said
Einstein,
that.
Okay.
Einstein said that.
Yeah.
So I have nothing else on this essay, and so I'm just going to piggyback on your comments because
all right. Well, so we've talked about these main philosophical influences or reflections he had, which led him away from naturalism as a whole and the material view of mind as a subset. And then on page 93, middle, he says, at the time of my conversion to Christianity, many of my closest friends were recent Catholic converts, and my wife, through some of the same influences, have been seriously considered joining the Catholic Church. So, we're not alone. And we may have all these thoughts and come to the conclusion that we suddenly find out that, gee, there's someone else in the room too, and they've had the same questions and come out with some of the same answers, which again, it's that beautiful phrase from the letter of the Hebrews, the cloud of witnesses, that we're surrounded by.
The other thing that's interesting about this man's story, unlike many other conversion stories, is that it wasn't as though there was some big dramatic moment of realizing all these things. He says it really was a gradual growth and movement, like as if you're going more and more into the light, and he said there was really no decisive moment of final commitment. The closest thing, this is the top of 93, the closest thing to a moment of conversion occurred during a conversation with two Christian friends of mine in which I made explicit a certain realization that I was already a Christian. It's kind of like, that's another beautiful thing about reading conversion stories. Every single one of them is unique because each of these individuals is unique. And some have these dramatic experiences and some have more gradual realizations. And anyway.
There's a wonderful line or two in Hopkins's poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland, where he talks about the two different types of conversion. So it's the once at a crash called or the slow melting Augustine. So that, again, these two different, one's gradual, takes years and years, and the other it hits you like a flash of lightning.
And I would say that even the ones that have sorts of flash of lightning experiences, to Father's point, if you look back after that moment, you'll see all the people, all the sowers of all those seeds that had been there growing all along. It just took a kind of dramatic jolt for you to see it.
On page 94, he talks about a new paragraph there. He thought it was clearly desirable to belong in a substantial, meaningful way to a historical church. And then dropping down to 10 lines, the seeds for this, my wife and I visited many of the most magnificent churches in Europe. So there's that sense also of the beauty embodied in past Christian ages, and in the present too, but where you see that the fruits of Christianity, yes, there have been wars, yes, you can point to evils, bad popes, bad, Catholics, but look at what the lasting things are they left behind, these great cathedrals. And then at the bottom, he says, the third reason, Jesus evidently intended there should exist a visible church with a visible unity. And so, like you say, Vivian, it wasn't sudden, but all these kind of cumulative experiences converged.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so we basically moved from philosophy to history to beauty, and then ultimately to revelation, right? To the words of Scripture itself. In that process, we've just delineated there.
Yes, and well, I forgot what I was going to say. But so should we pass on to Of Towers and Tongues by Neal Judisch, or Judisch?
Yes.
Now here we have a different starting point because, as he says in 99, second paragraph, in what follows, I describe my transition from evangelical Christianity to historically minded Reformed Christian to Catholic Christian. That's a path which many followed, but it's a different path going from materialism or naturalism or atheism to Christianity.
Yeah, the first three essays were all conversions from atheism. This is a conversion from evangelicalism to Catholicism, right?
I noticed on page 100, middle there, I picked up C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So there we go again.
Yep.
Yep. And in fact, 2 pages earlier, he talks about C.S. Lewis's glancing blow at Freud. Is at this point worth quoting in full? And he does actually quote it in full. So we see Lewis's giant presence once again in this process.
And then a new name pops up on page 102 in the footnotes. Father Louis Bouillet, the spirit and influence of Protestantism, who himself was a Lutheran and became a Catholic and a Catholic priest. So certainly for these philosophers, books were a part of the equation, led the books and people, and then, I guess we'd say the beauty of art and architecture all seem to be converging for them.
Right. Also, again, how intellectually rigorous they are in the way they go about learning about the faith. And we will see in other places this flirtation, at least for a time, with Calvinism, because Calvinism is this very systematic and everything. The problem, it's so systematic that it too leads to ridiculous conclusions. But so like he moves beyond Calvinism, and on 102, the bottom of that first big paragraph, he says, on this picture then, meaning the Calvinist view of things, the non-Calvinist Christian is either intellectually defective or morally compromised. All thanks to God, the Calvinist is neither. I mean, if that really is your view of the thing, I don't see how it could be satisfying for long. And it wasn't for him. He moved beyond Calvinism and then went to the Southern Baptists, then to the Presbyterians. So each step along the way, he's going about this in a very rigorous way, comparing all these claims of these different Protestant churches against each other. And
it's also a little bit amusing that these people begin being so anti-Catholic that they have to approach the church on stepping stones, going from one Protestant denomination to the other, each of them just slightly closer to the real thing, until eventually they realize the truth staring them in the face.
Right. That's right.
I've got 115, but you may have things before that.
Oh, no, I'm happy to.
Well, let's pause at 109 just to illuminate a bit of the Calvinist past of his. The paragraph at the bottom, the guiding idea of presuppositionalism, which is the Calvinist doctrine, is that total depravity is equally a moral volitional condition and an intellectual noetic condition, so that the autonomous reason of unregenerate persons inevitably runs against Reformed Christian truth. So there's a problem there, in that if you're beginning from the Calvinist point of view, where you're holding that man's reason is unreliable, I mean, that's a poison. Because, of course, the fact is, you have to ask whether that's reasonable or not to hold that. So there's kind of an internal paradox there, a contradiction. which he realized.
Look how similar that problem is to the naturalism. I mean, if your thoughts are just molecules colliding for reasons that could be related to the weather or your diet or heaven only knows what, then how can your thoughts be reliable? How can they apply to anything that's real? How will you know if your thoughts apply to anything that's real? You end up in the same problem if you start questioning your own mind's ability to think reasonably and rationally.
And it's ironic because they both extremes, if you like, end up in the same absurdity. So on the one hand, you have this philosophical materialism, which it basically insists on reason alone, and that this reason alone leads to this irrational belief in there's nothing but matter. And then you have this other extreme from the Calvinists. No, you don't trust reason, which means you then end up with a relativism, which ends up with the same ultimate philosophical materialism. So you're coming to the same absurdity from two extremes of the spectrum, if you like. One is voluntarism, and the other is strict rationalism.
Yes, I mean, I guess all roads lead away from Rome, I would say. Yeah. You know, if you follow these presuppositions out, they lead you into absurdity.
Right, exactly. And what it involves is the separation of fides et ratio, right? They're separating faith and reason, and you end up in reductio ad absurdum in consequence.
So, Joseph, would you quote me sometime in one of your books? Because I don't write anything, you know, but every once in a while I come up with a thought which is probably printable anyway, or memorable. Let's see. Oh, I have something on page 112.
Yeah, carry on, because I'm not to 115. Okay. So yeah.
New paragraph. Yet even this much historical philosophical inquiry disclosed the profoundly innovative character of classical Protestant theory. So he realizes that whatever Protestantism is, it's an innovation. Mm-hmm. And so he goes on later in that paragraph. So as a Protestant, I had to accept that the justification of sola fide, it's actually sola fide, that's a mistake we got to correct, was at once one, central to the gospel and to the legitimacy of any pretended Christian church, thus necessitating schism with the apostate Roman See, but two, unheard of until Luther discovered in the 16th century, in tandem with the emerging modernist philosophy employed in its development. So that's an interesting kind of intellectual conclusion. He comes, wait a minute, if Luther's right, then he's the first one to be right on this topic, and everybody missed a boat for 1,600 years, or 1,500 years.
There was also a book, I can't remember which book it was, but I think it was a book we had, we discussed in the Form Book Club. There was this, how Lutheranism had its philosophical roots in nominalism.
Nominalism, yes.
The rejection of scholasticism. So we see this relativistic error at the very outset of Protestant theology.
At least one book that develops that is Bob Riley's A Defense of the Founding, because he does go in at some length about Luther's ideas having political philosophical consequences.
Yeah, as I was saying that, actually, grappling with which book it was, I was thinking in the back of my mind it might have been Bob Riley's book on the founding. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, anything before my 115?
Well, yes. Speaking of call-outs to different authors, this N.T. Wright.
Yes, yeah. He comes up.
He comes up in other essays as well, and he comes out very strongly here. So, do you know anything about him, Father? I mean, I think he must be Protestant. He's published by InterVarsity Press. And
yeah, he's a Protestant, and in my formative years in theology, the Trinity was right, bright, and Albright. And, one was an archaeologist and one was a philosopher, and I forget what the other one was, but they were luminaries in the Protestant universe, and they were widely read and rightly so. And So N.T. Wright is a very, very well-known and influential at the time Anglican theologian. I got something on page 117.
Well, you're leapfrogging my 115. I've been waiting patiently for here. Then,
oh,
Father.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So just at the bottom paragraph there, I'm not going to quote the whole thing because I've got the whole passage highlighted, but the unwelcome conclusion, most of what I found invigorating in Wright was there already in the Fathers and in the long Catholic history leading up to the Protestant Reformation. What I found new and insightful and wonderful in Wright and in allied Protestant scholars was, to an appreciable degree, a reinvention of the wheel. In other words, all that's good. And then he goes on, of course, then to began to feel like G.K. Chesterton's adventurer who planted triumphantly the flag in his old hometown, not realizing the flag had been flying centuries before his arrival. So he's obviously taking a Chestertonian idea of, I'm the man who with great utmost daring discovered what had been discovered before. From orthodoxy, I think. Right. And then after that, we have probably, he mentioned after Chesterton there, Peter Kraft, John Henry Newman, Henri de Lubac, and Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. So all the giants here, ushering him in the right direction, should we say.
Yep. Dangerous to read them.
Right. In fact, he even refers to them as forbidden fruit fascination, right? He'd been predisposed to thinking that Catholicism was off limits, and here he is, with a little bit of fear and trepidation reading these Catholic authors. But notice how this Mr. Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, set the stage for this because he began to show how different Christian doctrines had long in the past of the church been developed, right? The fathers of the church and so on. And as Newman himself said, anyone who starts reading the fathers of the church is not going to stay a Protestant for long.
117, paragraph at the bottom, looking back, I suppose the final straw for me concerned the issue of ecclesial authority. And that comes up in almost all of them.
Yes.
That eventually you have to say, well, wait a minute. I mean, if God exists and Christ is his son, he saved us, well, how do we know what's true and what's not about him?
How do we know which books belong in the Bible? How do we know
exactly.
When Scripture seems to be ambiguous or even seemingly contradictory? How do we know the right interpretation and all the rest of it? Ultimately, you do come down to this question of who has the authority to define Christianity.
And I want to make my last bleat a little quote from the Benedict quote on page 121, but I will yield to others who have something else to say before
I only want to comment on the quote right at the very end of his essay, so you're good at the moment.
Well, that is what I'm talking about. Oh no, I see, you're right. So on page 121, this kind of shows the subtle humor of Pope Benedict too. If in the course, this is about a third of the way down, if in the course of history, the attribution of such authority to men could repeatedly engender not the entirely unfounded suspicion of human arrogation of power, not only the promise of the New Testament, but also the trajectory of that history itself prove the opposite. The men in question are so glaringly, so blatantly unequal to this function, that the very empowerment of man to be the rock makes evident how little it is they who sustain the church, but God alone who does so, who does so more in spite of men than through them. The mystery of the cross is perhaps nowhere so palpably present as in the primacy as a reality of church history.
The primacy of the papal office.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he wrote that before he was Pope, but he did not retract it once he was Pope either. Joseph, I will give you the last word.
Well, you'll be giving Chesterton the last word. So, I think it's very appropriate. It says a great deal about the thinking behind this philosopher's approach to the church, that he has this very lengthy quote you just quoted from by Pope Benedict, but then finishes with a quote from Chesterton from the Catholic Church and conversion. And it's the famous quote that the moment that one men cease to pull against the church, they feel a tug towards it. So this is really exactly what this author has done here. He starts off with all the prejudices. So, he's pulling against every time he sees something which seems to suggest there's something more in Catholicism than he thought. He would pull against it, and then bit by bit by bit, he's being pulled in. And at some point, then, of course, you cease pulling against it, and you let yourself be pulled. And at that point, there's only one place you're going to end up. Yes,
and he talks about the church as being a trap. It kind of entices you. And the last part of that quote: "It is not the Pope who has set the trap, or the priest who baited it. The whole point of the position is that the trap is simply the truth."
Yeah, wonderful.
Amen. We'll see you next week, folks, discussing faith and reason. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.